One person watching all this with much interest is Paul Farrow, the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, who I spoke with late this week.
Absolutely, absolutely. And whilst we're supportive of a future Made in Australia policy, I think what we need to be mindful of is we need policy that has one eye on the future and one eye on right here, right now, because our industries such as Qenos are struggling. And so to make sure that we have a manufacturing base that survives a transition, we want to make sure that the manufacturing industries that are here today are here for tomorrow and the future as well.
Okay, but then given the fact that Qenos' operations are in Botany, right in the heart of Sydney, and in Altona, right in the heart of Melbourne, having petrochemical companies in those areas, from an environmental point of view, well, let's say politically, it's a bit tough these days for governments.
Yeah, and it is, I think, and I'm sure there is many environmental activists that are celebrating these types of announcements. But those same people will enjoy the spoils of the products that these companies have manufactured for decades and decades. And not just the company, not companies like Qenos, where we're talking raw material at its rawest form that ends up in household products at the end of the day, that ends up in downstream manufacturing, where people are filling, the bottles that are made from the polyurethane that they actually create, or the businesses that surround our Botany plant that rely on downstream products to keep their plant running as well. So this has greater impacts than just Qenos.
The one thing that gets me about this, the strategic importance of it, is even the pipes that carry our water and our sewage. There's nothing more basic that if somebody overseas were to cut off that supply or to endanger that supply, we could be literally drowning in the stuff.
No, absolutely right, Ross. I think it's extremely frustrating from where we sit. I am sick and tired of saying, I told you so, from our union's perspective. 2015, we said, this is what's coming when it comes to gas. We need a gas reservation policy. It hasn't come into effect. As a result, what we've seen is an emissions targets put in, we've got safeguard mechanisms put in, and now we have an industry that is part of the safeguard mechanism that's fallen over. Now, I know Qenos is probably a little bit more complex. There's land involved. The purchaser of the business is not interested in continued operations. It's a little bit more complex than just energy by itself. But I think what's frustrating is that we need to make sure that those policies about future Made in Australia is actually looking at what do we make here now, how are we protecting that, and the fundamental question is, do we want to be a country that makes things? Do we want to be a country that has highly skilled jobs, highly paid jobs, and that can stand on its own 2 feet? Or do we want to be a country that just gives up, puts the white flag up and says, we'll just import everything from somewhere else?
So, and there is the importance here, because even from an emissions point of view, the gas that's used in creating polyethylene actually goes into the product. It's not burnt, so there are no emissions as such. So there is a fundamental difference as to why you needed a gas reservation and a certainty of supply of gas and price of gas for these types of companies.
Absolutely. And that, again, another frustration. We're not talking about gas right now. And this is frustrating from both sides of politics, including my own side of politics. We're talking solar, we're talking wind, which we support that transition on. We have the opposition talking nuclear. We've traditionally had a position on nuclear. There's a reason we're not talking about nuclear right here and right now, is because it's not the issue that's facing our members or the sites that they work on. When I get around to sites, none of my members, none of the employers that they work for are talking about what the future energy needs are going to be in 10, 15 years' time. They're talking about the struggles that they face now. They're talking about gas. They're talking about cheap, reliable, sustainable power, and the answer is gas.
And the reality is that manufacturing workers and manufacturing industry, though the government is trying to now regenerate that with potentially billions of dollars of handouts or loans, the fact is that the ones that are on the ground right now, the jobs that are there, they're disappearing. And they're skilled workers that really will not have a future, or their kids might not have a future.
That's right, and that's a real concern to us, Ross. I think, if we continue on this current trajectory, we can see that there's probably going to be more industries like this that face the same fate. We don't want to see that. What we want to see is our existing manufacturing base, and let's face it, we've got at the moment, we've got a housing crisis, and we've got environmental activists that are talking about stopping timber, banning forestry, don't like steel, don't like glass, don't like concrete products. Well, you can't make houses out of rainbows. So the last time I checked was we need timber, so we can import it, but we're just offshoring our problems. We need concrete. Houses are made of aluminium, steel, glass, concrete products, timber.
And you'd like to think some of that was made here.
That has to be made here.
And plastics are a part of that.
Plastics are a huge part of that as well.
It's not as though the plastics aren't going to be made somewhere else.
That's
and that
right.
There's not going to be, if you worry about the environment, there's not going to be an environmental issue somewhere else.
No, and that is the frustrating thing from Qenos. Like we have been in discussion, the rumour mill's been circling around for quite some time on Qenos. Our members are extremely frustrated, with the, I would say, nicely dishonesty of what the end result of the rumour has ended up being, right? Because they know there's been a cloud over them. They know that there's been a potential buyer, and whether that potential buyer had a future interest in the ongoing operations was uncertain. So to find out on Wednesday morning that not only had they been sold, but they'd also been placed into voluntary administration immediately was a complete shock. So that is something that I think we would have liked to have seen a little bit more messaging from Qenos as to say, we've got some problems, we need some assistance. Those calls have never come.
No.
And I think from a government point of view, which I'm not expecting government to be running around auditing how businesses are tracking, but we need to have some mechanism in place that looks at our sovereign capability, that looks at our risks, and especially when we know that this is the only supplier of this product in the country, then we need to make sure, well, what is our long-term strategy in protecting that?
Because there's one other aspect of this, if I can pick it up. It's a bit like when the car manufacturing industry disappeared. First I think it was Ford went first, then it was GM. But the reality was all of the car parts supplier who were alongside it couldn't just justify their business with one company, which was Toyota, that was left. In this case, you make the observation at the Botany plant, there's also Indorama, Ixom, Orica, that all are in that same area,
yes,
in Botany, in Banks Meadow. And so if one walks out, which is likely to happen, their future becomes questionable as well.
That's right. And so we'll be in discussions with them in coming days as well. The Botany plant has a site utilities, which is operated by Qenos. So some of the sites rely on the steam, the water, the effluent, so a lot of the products, and some Indorama relies on the ethylene that comes out of the Qenos plant. Now, the Qenos plant at Botany has been in a shutdown state for 12 months because of a cooling tower collapse. Frustrating to our members is the day that was ready to be turned on, they got told, stop, don't turn back on, we're in a review, we're reviewing the business. So that, the plant is in a state of readiness, ready to go. But it's now looking like it's going to be deconstructed. It's going to be knocked down, and so we will need to make sure that that the surrounding businesses are secured and are viable going forward, so that they're not meeting the same fate. And we need to make sure that we've got the right policies in place to ensure that this just doesn't creep into other industries as well.
Yeah,
and I think that's where the point of course, we want to see positive announcements around future made in Australia is great. But we need to worry about what's happening right here, right now as well.
Paul Farrow, always good to have you in the program. Many thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ross. Much appreciated.